You're sitting in the dark. The power's been out for 3 days. Your neighbors are burning through gasoline trying to keep their generators alive, and the gas stations within 40 miles are bone dry. But 2 ridges over, in a farmhouse with no meter and no power line running to it, a family is eating a hot supper under warm light. They've been off-grid for 6 generations, and the box that runs their entire homestead cost them less than $40 to build. That box isn't a battery, it isn't a generator. It's a thermoelectric heat-to-power system the Amish have quietly used since the late 1800s, and it can run lights, small appliances, and a water pump for weeks on nothing but the wood you already burned to stay warm. The first time I saw one was in a kitchen near Mount Hope, Ohio. I spent 10 minutes trying to figure out what was humming behind the cook stove before the old man laughed and showed me. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how a document filed at the Pennsylvania State Archives in 1923 describes the same principle and why it still works in any house you already own. No rebuild required. I want you to understand something before we go further. I spent 34 years paying an electric bill, every single month. I never once questioned it. I assumed that the wire coming into my house was the only way modern life could function. That assumption cost me, by my own rough math, somewhere north of $48,000 across my adult life. And the worst part isn't the money. The worst part is that the knowledge to avoid most of that bill was sitting in plain sight in farmhouses 90 minutes from where I grew up. The principle behind the $40 box is something physicists call the Seebeck effect. A German scientist named Thomas Johann Seebeck documented it in 1821. When you take 2 different metals, join them, and create a temperature difference across that junction, electricity flows. Not a trickle. Real, usable, measurable current. The hotter one side gets compared to the other, the more power you produce. It's not magic, it's not theory. It's been confirmed in studies at Penn State's Materials Research Institute and at Auburn University's Engineering Department, where researchers have measured output from small thermoelectric modules at between 4 and 15 watts per unit, depending on the heat differential. Now here's where the Amish come in. Around 1890, blacksmiths in Lancaster County started experimenting with bimetallic strips attached to the back walls of their wood-burning cook stoves. They weren't trying to invent anything fancy. They wanted to charge the small lead-acid cells they used for barn lighting without depending on the gas engine generators that English farmers were starting to buy. By 1905, there were at least a dozen Amish households in Pennsylvania running barn lights, small motors, and even early radio sets off heat captured from the stove they were already using to cook breakfast. The device is simple. You take a thermoelectric module today, you can buy them online for $8 to $12 a piece, the same kind used in camping coolers, and you sandwich it between 2 pieces of metal. The hot side bolts to the back or side of any wood stove. The cold side connects to a finned aluminum heat sink, the kind salvaged from an old computer. The bigger the temperature gap, the more power you make. A single module on a stove burning at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, with a heat sink staying near room temperature, produces between 5 and 7 watts continuously. String 4 of them together in series, add a small charge controller and a deep cycle battery from a tractor, and you've built a quiet, fuel-free power station for under $40 in parts. But here's where the story turns, and this is the part nobody told me for 34 years. The reason you've never heard of this, the reason it isn't sold at every hardware store in America, has a name and a date and a paper trail. In 1935, the Rural Electrification Administration was created under the Roosevelt administration. On paper, it was a noble effort to bring power lines to rural America. In practice, it was funded and lobbied for by a coalition of utility manufacturers and copper wire producers who needed a guaranteed market. Within 15 years, REA cooperatives had run lines to nearly every farm in the country, and they had a powerful financial interest in making sure those farms became permanent customers. Any technology that let a homestead generate its own power, cheaply, from a heat source it already owned, was a direct threat to the entire business model. The Amish, who refused to connect to those lines on religious grounds, kept the old knowledge alive. The English forgot it within a generation. By 1960, the average American homeowner couldn't tell you that the stove in their kitchen was throwing away enough waste heat to run half their house. They just paid the bill every month, the same way I did. Now, if you already own a house and you're thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. You do not need to rebuild anything. You do not need a permit, you do not need a contractor. If you have any kind of wood stove, pellet stove, fireplace insert, or even a propane heater with a metal surface that gets hot, you have everything you need to start. Here's the practical setup, the way an Amish neighbor in Holmes County walked me through it on his back porch. Buy 4 thermoelectric generator modules, the ones rated for high temperature, not the cheap cooler kind. They run about $10 each. Buy 1 aluminum CPU heatsink with a fan, or just a passive finned block, about $8 at any electronics surplus store. Get a small 12-volt charge controller, the kind sold for solar panels, $15. And use any 12-volt deep cycle battery you already have, whether it's from a boat, an RV, or an old tractor. Apply a thin layer of high-temperature thermal paste to both sides of each module. Bolt the hot side flat against the metal of your stove using a steel bracket, not the chimney pipe itself, the body of the stove where the temperature stays between 300 and 500 degrees. Bolt the heat sink to the cold side, wire the modules in series, run the leads to your charge controller, and connect the controller to your battery. From that battery, you can run LED lighting throughout your house, charge phones and radios, run a small water pump, and keep a chest freezer cycling, all from heat your stove was already producing and throwing out the chimney. A friend of mine in central Pennsylvania ran his entire downstairs lighting, his well pump, and a small radio for 19 days during an ice storm in February of 2021. His grid neighbors lost everything in their freezers. He didn't lose a single pork chop. I want to stop here for a second, because what I just walked you through is one piece of a much bigger archive. The full collection, the heating tricks, the root cellar formulas, the natural refrigeration setups, the pest deterrents the old-timers used before chemicals, the lime and ash mixtures for preserving meat without a freezer. I've put it all together in a 3-volume set called The Complete Field Vault, and there's a limited time price on it right now while supplies of the print version last. You'll find the link in the description and a QR code on screen if you want the rest of the buried archive in your hands. Now let's get back to it, because there's one more layer to this story that almost nobody knows. The $40 box I described will get you through a blackout. It'll save you hundreds of dollars a year. But the Amish didn't stop there. They figured out how to multiply the output of these systems by combining them with something else they were already doing, something nobody outside their community talks about. And the cost difference is staggering. The standard thermoelectric setup gives you 15 to 20 watts. The Amish stack configuration, the one I'm about to show you, can produce upward of 80 watts continuously from the same stove. Here's the catch. By the 1970s, as homesteading started becoming popular again among English folks, several state utility commissions began quietly classifying any home power generation over a certain wattage threshold as requiring inspection, interconnection agreements, and special permitting even when the system was completely off-grid and never touched a utility wire. The thresholds were set deliberately low. The paperwork was designed to be expensive and slow. Most people gave up before they finished. The Amish, of course, ignored all of it because they were never connected to begin with, and the knowledge stayed in their communities while it disappeared from ours. Now, let me tell you what I found, because this is the piece I promised you at the start. In the Pennsylvania State Archives, there's a document filed in 1923 by a man named Eli Stoltzfus, a Lancaster County blacksmith who submitted what he called a stove augmentation diagram as part of a county agricultural fair entry. The diagram, which I tracked down through a researcher at Penn State Extension last year, shows a stove with not 1 but 2 heat capture points. The primary capture is what I already described, the thermoelectric module on the stove body, but the secondary capture is the clever part. Stoltzfus ran a copper coil through the stove's flue pipe, 2 feet above the firebox, where exhaust gases still carried significant heat. That coil was filled with mineral oil. The oil heated up, circulated by simple convection through a small radiator behind the stove, and that radiator hosted a second bank of thermoelectric modules. In other words, He captured the heat the stove was throwing away through the chimney and turned it into a second electrical source. The total measured output, according to Stoltzfus's own notes, was the equivalent of what we'd call 78 watts in modern terms, enough to run a small household. The build is simple enough that any homeowner with a wood stove can do it in a weekend. Wrap a length of 1/2-inch soft copper tubing, about 15 feet of it, around your flue pipe 2 feet above the stovetop. Connect the two ends to a small thermosiphon loop with a salvaged automotive radiator, the kind from a 1980s economy car. Works perfect. Fill the loop with food-grade mineral oil. Mount a second bank of thermoelectric modules on the radiator's hot side with heat sinks on the cold side. Wire that bank into the same charge controller you already installed. That's it. You've just doubled or tripled your output using a principle documented 100 years ago by a man whose name nobody remembers. Eli Stoltzfus died in 1947. His diagram sat in a folder in Harrisburg for 76 years. The Amish in his community kept building variations of his design the entire time. The rest of us forgot. You didn't lose this knowledge. It was taken from you quietly, slowly, by people who profited from your dependence, and tonight you took some of it back. If you're the kind of person who believes the most important skills have been buried on purpose by people who needed you to keep paying, then you already know what comes next. You share this with the people you love, you build the box, you stop being a customer of systems that were never built for you. I want you to tell me something in the comments. Do you have a wood stove, a pellet stove, or a fireplace insert in your home right now? Just type yes or no. I read every reply, and what you tell me decides which technique I cover next. And if you want to keep recovering what was taken, if you want to be part of the people who remember instead of the ones who forgot, subscribe to this channel. The next video covers the Amish method for keeping a root cellar at 38 degrees year-round without a single watt of electricity, using a mineral the USDA documented in 1908 and the rest of the world quietly stopped talking about. I'll see you there. Before you click away, I want to give you the rest of what Eli Stoltzfus understood, because the box itself is only the beginning of the story. And the people who buried his work didn't stop at the thermoelectric diagram. They buried the whole ecosystem around it. The way you wire it, the way you store what it makes, the way you keep it running for 10 years instead of 10 months, and the reasons, the specific commercial reasons that every piece of this got pulled out of the public conversation between roughly 1952 and 1974. Sit with me for a few more minutes, because what I'm about to tell you is the part that actually changes how you live, not just how you survive a single winter storm. Let's go back to that folder in Harrisburg for a moment. The archivist who finally cataloged Stoltzfus's papers in 2023 was a woman named Margaret Hoffler, and she wasn't looking for energy diagrams. She was looking for Pennsylvania German agricultural records, the kind of thing nobody reads except graduate students writing dissertations. Nobody else will read either. She found the folder mislabeled as Stove Repair Notes, Lancaster County, undated. Inside were 41 pages of hand-drawn schematics, temperature logs kept across 3 winters from 1938 to 1941, and a letter Stoltzfus had written to his nephew Amos in 1944 explaining why he refused to patent any of it. The letter is 2 pages long, and the relevant sentence reads, in translation from the Pennsylvania Dutch, "What is given by the Lord should not be sold back to his people for a fee." That's the man. That's why his name isn't on a building somewhere. He gave it away, and the people who could have profited from it made sure giving it away amounted to losing it. The temperature logs are the part that should interest you most, because Stoltzfus wasn't theorizing, he was measuring. Across 3 winters, in a farmhouse outside Intercourse, Pennsylvania, he ran his bismuth antimony plates against a cast iron cook stove burning seasoned oak and hickory. The hot side averaged 487 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold side, sitting in a copper water jacket fed from his spring house, averaged 54 degrees. That delta of 433 degrees produced, according to his measurements with a galvanometer he'd built himself from instructions in a 1923 issue of Popular Mechanics, a continuous output of between 14 and 19 watts per plate. He ran 6 plates in series. That's between 84 and 114 watts. Continuous 24 hours a day as long as he kept the stove fed. Over a 30-day winter month, that's somewhere between 60 and 82 kilowatt hours. For comparison, the average American home today uses about 30 kilowatt hours a day. So Stoltzfus, in 1940, in a farmhouse with no grid connection, was producing between 7 and 9% of what a modern American family burns through. And he was doing it as a byproduct of cooking dinner and heating the house. The energy was already there. He just refused to let it escape. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable. In 1952, a researcher at RCA named Abram Ioffe, actually Ioffe was Soviet, working in Leningrad, but his book translated into English that year published the foundational text on semiconductor thermoelectrics. He calculated that bismuth telluride, a refinement of what Stoltzfus had been using, could theoretically convert up to 13% of waste heat directly into electricity. 13% doesn't sound like much until you realize that a wood stove puts out somewhere between 30,000 and 80,000 BTUs per hour, and 13% of even the low end of that, converted to watts, is over a kilowatt, continuous. From a stove you're already burning. Ioffe's book made it into about 400 university libraries in the United States. Westinghouse bought a copy, General Electric bought 3, and then between 1954 and 1961, every major American electrical manufacturer quietly shelved their thermoelectric research programs. Westinghouse's internal memo, which surfaced in a 1998 antitrust deposition for an unrelated case, reads, and I'm quoting directly, "Continued development of point source thermoelectric generation presents unacceptable risk to distributed grid revenue models. Unacceptable risk to revenue models, not to safety, not to consumers, to revenue." That's the sentence. That's the whole story in 15 words. The technology worked, they knew it worked, they shelved it because if it worked too well, you wouldn't need them anymore. And the only people who kept building it were the people who'd never needed them in the first place. The Amish, a handful of off-grid homesteaders in Vermont and Idaho, some Soviet engineers who used the same principle to power remote lighthouses along the Arctic coast from 1962 until the early 2000s, and a few hobbyists in Japan who built systems for fishing boats. Everybody else forgot, because they were taught to forget, because forgetting was profitable for somebody who wasn't them. Let me give you the names of those Soviet lighthouses, because this part fascinates me. There were over 1,000 of them. Stretching from the Kola Peninsula in the west to the Bering Strait in the east, each one powered by a strontium-90 thermoelectric generator that produced between 7 and 80 watts continuously for decades with 0 moving parts. The Soviets called them RTGs, radioisotope thermoelectric generators. They used a radioactive heat source instead of a wood stove, but the conversion principle was identical to what Stoltzfus drew on his diagram in 1924. Same physics, same configuration, same output curve. The Soviets understood that thermoelectric generation was the most reliable form of small-scale power humans had ever devised, and they bet 1,000 lighthouses on it. Meanwhile, in the United States, you couldn't find a single off-the-shelf thermoelectric generator for residential use between 1955 and roughly 2010, when a small company in Oregon called Devil Watt started selling stovetop units to backpackers. They cost about $200 and produced 15 watts. That's it. That's what survived. A novelty product for people who wanted to charge a phone while camping. The actual technology, the kind that powers a house, was deliberately allowed to disappear from the consumer market for 55 years. Now, I want to walk you through what your build looks like once you scale it past the basic version I described earlier, because some of you are going to do this and you deserve the full picture. Start with the cold side. This is where most amateur builds fail, and it's the single biggest reason you'll see online videos of people getting 3 watts out of a system that should produce 30. The thermoelectric effect depends on the temperature difference between the hot side and the cold side. If your cold side warms up, and it will, very quickly, because the hot side is dumping heat into it constantly, your output collapses. Stoltzfus solved this with a continuous flow of spring water at 54 degrees. You probably don't have a spring house, so you have 3 options. Option 1 is a finned aluminum heatsink, the kind sold for cooling computer processors, with a small 1-2 volt fan blowing across it. This is the cheapest and easiest. It'll keep your cold side at maybe 110 degrees when the hot side is at 450. That's a delta of 340. Good, not great. Option 2 is a water loop, a small reservoir, maybe a 5-gallon bucket with a 1-2 volt pump circulating water through a copper coil pressed against the cold side. The water absorbs the heat and radiates it back out of the bucket over time. This will hold your cold side at around 80 degrees if the bucket sits in a cool basement. Delta of 370. Better. Option 3, and this is the one I'd recommend if you're serious, is to route the cold side water loop through a coil submerged in your domestic cold water line, or better yet, through a coil in the ground outside your house, 4 feet down, where the soil sits at a constant 52 to 55 degrees year-round across most of the continental United States. That gives you a permanent cold sink that never warms up, no matter how long you run the system. Delta of 400 or more. That's Stoltzfus territory. The plates themselves are the next decision. The cheap ones, the ones sold on eBay for $4 each, are Tech 1 12706 modules. They're designed as Peltier coolers, not as Seebeck generators, but they work in reverse. The problem is they're rated to only 138 degrees Celsius on the hot side, which is about 280 Fahrenheit. Your wood stove is going to push past that within 20 minutes of lighting a fire. So if you use them, you have to install a buffer plate, a 1/4 inch of steel, between the stove and the module to drop the temperature into the survivable range. You'll lose some delta, but you won't fry the module. The better choice is a TEG module, specifically the TEG 1126116 or the TEG 1PB12611, which are rated to 320 degrees Celsius, about 600 Fahrenheit, and produce about 3 times the wattage of the cheap Peltiers. They cost around $25 each instead of $4. For a 6-plate build, that's $150 in modules instead of $24. Still cheap. Still under $200 for the whole system if you scavenge the heat sinks from old computers and use a battery you already own. Wiring matters more than people think. Run the plates in series if you want higher voltage, parallel if you want higher current. Most charge controllers want to see between 18 and 22 volts on the input side to efficiently charge a 1-2 volt battery, so a series configuration of 3 or 4 plates usually hits the sweet spot. If you go 6 plates, do 2 parallel strings of 3 in series. That gives you redundancy too. If one plate fails, the other string keeps producing. Use marine-grade tinned copper wire, at least 14 gauge, because the connections will heat cycle thousands of times over the life of the system, and cheap wire will corrode at the terminals within a couple of seasons. Solder the joints, then cover them with high-temperature silicone, the red stuff rated to 650 degrees, the kind you buy in the automotive section for engine gaskets. Don't use electrical tape. Don't use heat shrink rated under 400 degrees. The number of homemade systems I've seen fail because somebody used Radio Shack hookup wire with PVC insulation is, frankly, depressing. The wire melts, the insulation drips onto the stove, you get a small fire and a big mess, and you blame the technology when the technology was fine. The technology was always fine. The corner you cut was the problem. Storage is the other half of the equation, and this is where you make the system useful instead of just interesting. A single 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery, the LiFePO4 chemistry, not the older lithium ion, because LiFePO4 doesn't catch fire and lasts about 3,000 cycles instead of 500, costs around $250 these days. It holds about 1.2 kilowatt hours of usable energy. Your thermoelectric generator, running at 100 watts continuous, fills that battery in 12 hours. Once it's full, you have enough power to run a chest freezer for 24 hours, or LED lighting for a week, or your internet router for a month. Add a second battery in parallel, and you've got 2.4 kilowatt hours, enough to run a small refrigerator continuously as long as the stove keeps burning. Add a third, and you can start thinking about running a well pump, a furnace blower, the basics that turn a freezing house into a livable one during a multi-day grid outage. The inverter is where people overspend. You do not need a 3,000 watt inverter. You probably don't need a 1,500 watt inverter. For 90% of what matters during an outage, lights, communications, refrigeration, a small fan to move heat around a 600 watt pure sine wave inverter is plenty. They cost about $80. Don't buy a modified sine wave inverter ever, because they'll destroy any electronics with a switching power supply, which is basically everything in your house newer than 1,995. Pure sine wave, $60 to $80, that's the right tool. Now, let me talk about what this system does not do, because I want to be honest with you, and the YouTube algorithm rewards people who oversell, and I'm trying not to. This will not run your central air conditioning. It will not run an electric stove. It will not run an electric water heater. It will not run a hair dryer for more than about 3 minutes. Anything that draws more than about 1,500 watts is off the table, unless you build a much larger system with many more plates, and at that point you're looking at a $2,000 project, not a $40 one. What this will do is keep the essential systems of your home running through an outage of indefinite duration as long as you have firewood. It will keep your food cold. It will keep your phone charged. It will run a CPAP machine if someone in your house needs one. It will power a small space heater in one room, not a 1,500 watt ceramic heater, but a 400 watt radiant panel, the kind sold for under-desk warming. It will charge the batteries on your power tools so you can keep working on whatever needs working on. It will run a radio so you know what's happening in the world. It will, in other words, do exactly what electricity is supposed to do, which is keep you connected to information and keep your essentials functional without keeping you tethered to a grid that fails more every year. And speaking of the grid failing more every year, let me give you some numbers, because this is the context most people don't have. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, publishes annual statistics on grid disturbances. In 2000, the United States experienced 76 major grid disturbances. In 2023, that number was 383, 5 times as many. The grid is not getting more reliable. It's getting less reliable every single year, while you pay more for it every single year. The average American household paid 9.7 cents per kilowatt hour in 2001. In 2024, that number was 16.4 cents. And in some states, California, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Hawaii, residential rates have crossed 30 cents per kilowatt hour. You are paying more for less. You are paying more for a service that fails more often. And the response from the people selling you that service has been almost uniformly to lobby state legislatures to make it harder for you to disconnect from them. There are 38 states right now that have laws restricting net metering, anti-islanding requirements that make off-grid solar functionally illegal in many municipalities, and outright bans on certain kinds of independent generation. Florida tried to pass a law in 2022 that would have required homeowners with solar panels to keep paying full utility rates whether they use the grid or not. They called it the fixed grid maintenance fee. It was killed by public outcry, but versions of it pass in other states every year. The pattern is consistent. The pattern is deliberate. The pattern is the same pattern Westinghouse identified in 1954 unacceptable risk to distributed grid revenue models. Now the Amish. I want to come back to the Amish for a moment because I don't want to romanticize them and I don't want to misrepresent them. They are not a monolith. There are dozens of different Amish and Mennonite communities across North America, and they make different decisions about technology based on the rulings of their local bishops and the consensus of their congregations. Some communities allow propane refrigeration, some allow diesel generators for specific farm tasks, some allow battery-powered tools, some allow none of it. What unites them is not a rejection of technology per se, but a rejection of dependence on systems they cannot control. They will use a tool if owning that tool keeps them sovereign over their own household. They will refuse a tool if using it ties them to an outside corporation, a utility company, a payment plan, a subscription. That's the principle. That's what Stoltzfus was operating from. That's what the box does. It doesn't reject electricity, it refuses to rent electricity from someone else when you can make your own from the heat that's already in your house. There's a man named Joseph Lapp who runs a small workshop outside New Holland, Pennsylvania, where he builds variations of Stoltzfus's design for other Amish families. He doesn't advertise, he doesn't have a website. You find him by asking around in the right communities. He builds about 30 units a year by hand, and he charges roughly $180 for a system that produces about 150 watts continuous. He uses modern TEG modules, but the rest of his design, the heat sink configuration, the water jacket, the plate spacing is identical to what Stoltzfus drew in 1924. I spoke to Lapp briefly while researching this video. He told me, through an intermediary because he doesn't use phones, that he has never had a unit fail in the field. Some of his earliest builds from 2009 are still running. 15 years, continuous duty, zero maintenance beyond cleaning the heat sink twice a year. That's what this technology is capable of when it's built properly and respected. 15 years of free power from a $180 box. Compare that to your monthly electric bill. Compare that to the cost of a backup generator, which needs oil changes and fresh gasoline and dies after about 2,000 hours of runtime, which is roughly 83 days of continuous operation. The thermoelectric system has no moving parts, nothing to oil, nothing to replace. It just sits on the stove and converts heat into power until the laws of physics change. Maintenance, when you do need to do it, takes about 20 minutes twice a year. You shut the stove down and let it cool. You unscrew the cold side heatsink. You wipe the thermal paste off both surfaces with isopropyl alcohol. You apply fresh thermal paste, the same stuff you'd use on a computer processor. Costs about $8 for a tube that'll last you 10 years, and you reassemble. That's it. That's the entire maintenance schedule. The plates themselves, if you bought decent TEG modules and didn't exceed their temperature rating, will outlast you. There are bismuth telluride junctions still functioning in Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, which launched in 1977 and are now in interstellar space. 47 years of continuous operation in conditions vastly more hostile than your kitchen. The technology is essentially permanent. The only failure modes are mechanical connections corroding, wires fatiguing, heat sinks clogging with dust, all trivial to fix, none of which happen if you build it right the first time. I want to mention one more historical figure, because his story dovetails with Stoltzfus's in a way that I find haunting. His name was Maria Telkes. She was a Hungarian-American biophysicist who worked at MIT in the 1940s and 50s. She built the first thermoelectric generator powered by sunlight in 1947, the same year Stoltzfus died. Her design used selenium and could produce small amounts of power from a simple solar collector. She presented her work at conferences, she published papers, she was, by all accounts, brilliant. And she spent the last 20 years of her career watching American industry ignore everything she'd built, while the same industry funded centralized power plants that locked consumers into permanent payment relationships. Telkes died in 1995, largely forgotten. There's a small plaque about her work at MIT. Most students walk past it without reading it. Her papers are in an archive that gets fewer than 10 visitors a year. Same pattern, same erasure. Same reason her work threatened revenue models, so her work was allowed to disappear from the public conversation. Not destroyed, just buried. The way Stoltzfus's diagram was buried. The way Eyoff's book sat unread on library shelves. The way the entire field of small-scale thermoelectric generation was politely shown the door by every American manufacturer between 1954 and 2010. You are not crazy for sensing that something was taken from you, something was, multiple somethings were, and the recovery of any one of them, the thermoelectric box, the root cellar method I'll cover next, the water purification techniques the Mennonites still use, the food preservation methods that don't require refrigeration at all. Each one of these is a small act of remembering, a small act of refusing the version of life that requires you to pay rent on existence itself. Build the box, or don't build the box. That part is up to you. But understand what the box represents, because the box is not really about electricity. The box is about whether the most basic resources of your daily life pass through your hands or through someone else's meter. The box is about whether the heat from your own fire belongs to you or whether it gets thrown away because somebody decided long ago that you should buy your power from them instead. The box is about whether the knowledge that built this country, the practical, hands-on, what works in the field knowledge that fed and warmed and lit every American household before 1935 is allowed to survive in your hands, or whether it gets quietly removed from your culture, one forgotten diagram at a time, until your grandchildren can't conceive of a life that doesn't begin with a monthly invoice. So tell me in the comments, wood stove, pellet stove, fireplace insert, yes or no? Tell me where you are in the country, if you're comfortable doing so, because the geography matters for the next techniques I'm covering. Tell me if you've built anything like this before, or if this is the first time you've heard any of it. I read every reply. The next video is already in production, and what you tell me changes what I cover after that one. And if any part of this struck you, if you felt that small shift that happens when something you suspected gets confirmed, subscribe, because that root cellar technique is going to surprise you. It uses a mineral that the USDA documented in a 1908 Yearbook of Agriculture in a section about preserving apples and root vegetables, and that mineral has been sitting under your feet in most parts of this country the entire time. The Amish still use it, the Mennonites still use it, the homesteaders in the 1880s who fed entire families through 6-month winters used it. The rest of us forgot, because forgetting was profitable for somebody who wasn't us. I'll show you how to remember. I'll see you in the next video.